The Adventure of Black Peter. I cannot recall a time when my friend Sherlock Holmes was in such perfect mental and physical form as he was in the year 1895. His fame was growing by the day, opening the door to countless cases, and among his clients were individuals of such standing that even the slightest hint as to the identity of those who crossed the threshold of our modest lodgings in Baker Street would have amounted to a betrayal of trust. Like all great artists, Holmes practiced his art for art's sake, and with the sole exception of the reward offered by the Duke of Holderness, I cannot remember a single instance in which he accepted substantial payment for the invaluable services he rendered. He was so self-satisfied, or perhaps so capricious, that he frequently refused to assist powerful and wealthy men when their problems failed to interest him, while devoting weeks on end to humble clients whose cases, by virtue of their oddity and originality, appealed to his imagination and stretched the limits of his intellect. During 1895, Holmes concerned himself with a remarkable series of cases, each strikingly different from the last. Among them were the celebrated investigation into the sudden death of Cardinal Tosca, undertaken at the personal invitation of His Holiness the Pope, and the affair in which he rid London's East End of a malignant scourge by bringing the notorious canary trainer Wilson to justice. These were followed in quick succession by the tragedy of Woodman's Lee and the mysterious death of Captain Peter Carey. Without committing this last, extraordinarily singular case to paper, no account of Sherlock Holmes's achievements could ever be considered complete. In the first week of July, I became aware that Holmes was pursuing something of importance, for he had begun to disappear frequently and for long stretches of time. From a number of rough-looking men who called at our rooms asking for Captain Basil, I gathered that he had once again assumed an alternative identity in order to conceal his formidable intellect. I knew that he maintained at least 5 small hideouts scattered across London, where he could change his appearance and manner with ease. He told me nothing of his activities, and it was never my habit to press my friend for confidences. The first tangible indication of the nature of his investigation, however, was truly extraordinary. That morning Holmes had left before breakfast. I had just seated myself at the table when he burst through the door, his hat still on his head and a harpoon tucked under his arm as though it were an umbrella. "My God!" I exclaimed. "You're not going to tell me you walked through the streets of London with that thing, are you?" "I only went as far as the butcher's and back." "The butcher's?" "Yes, and my appetite is prodigious. Exercise before breakfast is remarkably beneficial. I'll wager, though, that you'd never guess what sort of exercise I've been indulging in." "I wouldn't dream of trying." He chuckled as he poured himself some coffee. "If you could have looked into Allardyce's storage shed, you would have seen a pig's carcass hanging from a hook in the ceiling, and a gentleman with his sleeves rolled up attempting to stab it with this very weapon. That energetic fellow was me. And I can now state with certainty that it is impossible to drive a harpoon clean through a pig with a single thrust. Care to try?" "Most certainly not. And why on earth would you attempt such a thing?" "Because I suspect it may have some indirect connection with the mystery of Woodman's Lee." "Ah, Hopkins, I received your telegram last night. I was expecting you. Won't you join us?" Our visitor was a man of about 30, plainly dressed in a tweed suit and possessed of a careful, restrained manner. Yet his erect posture suggested someone accustomed to wearing a uniform. I recognized Stanley Hopkins at once. He was a young police inspector whose promise Holmes openly admired, and who in turn held the great consulting detective's scientific methods in the highest regard. Hopkins's brow was furrowed, and he sat down with an air of dejection. "Thank you, sir. I've already had breakfast. I came into town yesterday to submit my report and stayed the night." "And what sort of report did you submit?" "Nothing but complete failure. No progress at all." I'm afraid not. Good heavens. I should have taken charge of the matter myself. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Holmes. This is my first real opportunity, and I'm completely at a loss. I beg you, please help me. I've already read the existing evidence and studied the investigation report with care. Tell me, what do you make of the tobacco pouch found at the scene? Could it not provide a clue? Hopkins looked surprised. It belonged to the man himself. His initials were on it. It was made of sealskin. And after all, he was a former seal hunter. And yet he had no pipe. That's true, we found no pipe. But he rarely smoked. Perhaps he kept tobacco for his companions. Quite so. Had I been in charge of this case from the start, that is precisely where I would have begun. In the meantime, my friend Dr. Watson knows nothing of the affair. It would do me no harm to hear the facts laid out once more from beginning to end. Would you mind summarizing the case? Stanley Hopkins drew a sheet of paper from his pocket. I've made a few notes on the career of the deceased, Captain Peter Carey. He was born in 1845, which made him 50 years old. A daring and highly successful whaler and seal hunter, he captained the steamship Sea Unicorn of Dundee in 1883. After a series of profitable voyages, he retired in 1884. He spent several years traveling, then purchased a small property called Woodman's Lee near Forest Row in Sussex. He lived there for 6 years until he was murdered last week. He was a most peculiar man. In everyday life, he was stern, silent, and withdrawn. He lived with his wife, his 20-year-old daughter, and 2 servants. The servants changed frequently, as few could tolerate him for long. He did not drink often, but when he did, he became a brute. On one occasion, he threw his wife and daughter out of the house in the middle of the night and beat them so savagely on the grounds that the entire village was roused by the women's screams. Once, after severely beating the village priest, he was brought before a magistrate. In short, Mr. Holmes, he was a man of extraordinary violence. During his years at sea, I'm told his behavior was no better. His nickname was Black Peter, not merely because of his dark complexion and long beard, but because his presence inspired terror. I need hardly add that every one of his neighbors hated him, and that no one mourned his dreadful end. You've read the detailed description of his hut in the official report, Mr. Holmes, but I'll repeat it for your friend's benefit. A few hundred meters from the house stood a small building he had erected himself, which he called his cabin. He slept there every night. It was a single-room structure, roughly 5 by 3 meters. He always kept the key in his pocket, made his own bed, cleaned the place himself, and allowed no one else to set foot inside. The walls had small windows with curtains that were always drawn. One of these windows faced the main road. When the light was on at night, villagers would point at the window and speculate about what Black Peter was doing inside. It was this very window that provided us with one of the few minor clues in the investigation. 2 nights before the murder, at about 1 in the morning, a mason named Slater was returning from Forest Row when he passed near the property. He noticed a light shining through the trees. From a silhouette cast upon the curtain, he swore he saw a man turn his head to one side. The figure, he claimed, was not Peter Carey, whom he knew well. The man had a beard, but it was shorter than Carey's and jutted forward. That said, the witness had been drinking in a public house for 2 hours. The distance between the road and the hut was considerable, and the incident took place on Monday night, whereas the murder occurred on Wednesday. On Tuesday, Peter Carey was in a dreadful state. He was hopelessly drunk and raging through the house, sending the women fleeing in terror. Toward evening, he withdrew to his hut. Around 2 in the morning, his daughter, whose bedroom window was open, was awakened by a terrible noise coming from the cabin, but she paid it little attention, as his drunken bellowing was nothing unusual. When the servants rose at 7, they noticed that the door of Black Peter's hut was standing open. Even so, such was their fear of the man that no one dared investigate until midday. When they finally looked inside, the sight turned them pale with horror, and they ran at once to the village. An hour later, I arrived at the scene. You know, my nerves are fairly steady, Mr. Holmes, but even I was shaken the moment I entered the hut. The walls and floor were thick with flies, like a slaughterhouse, and the air buzzed as though I were standing inside a hive. Carrie always called the place his cabin, and indeed it contained everything one would expect to find aboard a ship: a bunk in the corner, a sea chest, charts, a picture of the sea unicorn, and shelves lined with logbooks. The man himself lay in the center of the room. His face was contorted as though by torture, his long grizzled beard twisted upward in agony. A harpoon had pierced him squarely through the chest and pinned him to the wooden wall behind, like an insect fixed in a collector's case. There was no doubt that he died at the instant he uttered his final cry. I followed your methods, sir. I allowed nothing to be disturbed before examining both the ground outside and the floor of the room. And yet, there were no footprints at all. You mean, said Holmes sharply, that there were absolutely no footprints? I assure you, there were absolutely no footprints whatsoever. My dear Hopkins, I have investigated many murders, but I have yet to encounter one committed by a creature that flies. As long as a murderer places his feet upon the ground, there must be some trace, an impression, a scuff, or, at the very least, a subtle disturbance. Such things never escape the notice of those versed in the science. That there should be no usable mark in a room soaked with blood is almost beyond belief. Still, you could hardly have overlooked certain objects that made their way into the official report, could you? The young inspector's face fell under my friend Holmes's cutting remarks. It was foolish of me not to come to you sooner, Mr. Holmes, but regret serves no purpose now. Yes, there were several objects in the room that demanded attention. First and foremost was the harpoon used in the murder. The killer had taken one from the wall. There were two others still hanging, with one space left empty. The harpoon bore the inscription, SSC Unicorn, Dundee. It appears the crime was committed in a sudden burst of rage, the murderer seizing the first weapon at hand. The fact that Peter Carey was fully dressed, despite the murder having taken place at 2 a.m, suggests he was expecting someone. The bottle of rum on the table, along with 2 dirty glasses, supports this conclusion. Yes, said Holmes. I believe that is a fair inference. Were there any other spirits in the room besides the rum? Yes, there was brandy and whiskey on the sideboard above the sea chest, but they were of no significance to us, as the bottles were full. Everything in a room has its significance, Holmes replied, but let us confine ourselves to the objects that appear directly relevant to this case. I found this tobacco pouch on the table. Where on the table? In the center. It was made of coarse, smooth-haired sealskin, tied with a leather thong. Inside the flap were the initials PC. There were roughly 15 grams of strong sailor's tobacco inside. Excellent. What else? Stanley Hopkins produced a khaki-colored notebook from his pocket. Its cover was frayed and torn, its pages badly faded. On the first page were the initials J. Chen and the date 1883. Holmes laid it on the table and examined it closely, while Hopkins and I leaned over his shoulder. On the second page, printed letters read CPR. The following pages were filled with numbers. Then came headings: Argentina, Costa Rica, San Paulo, each followed by page after page of symbols and figures. What do you make of this? Holmes asked. It looks like stock or bond transactions. JHN could be the initials of the broker. CPR might be the client. Could it not stand for Canadian Pacific Railway? Holmes suggested. Hopkins swore through clenched teeth and struck his thigh with his fist. "How stupid of me," he cried. "Of course, that must be it. The only thing left to determine is whose initials JH and R. I checked the stock exchange records, and there was no broker or independent trader with those initials operating in 1883. Still, I believe these letters are the most important clue we have. You'll agree, Mr. Holmes, that they could belong to the second person present in the cabin at the time of the murder, the killer himself. A document proving the existence of valuable bonds could also explain the motive for the crime. From the expression on his face, it was clear that this new development had surprised Holmes. "I agree with you," he said. "I must admit that this notebook, entirely absent from the official report, has the potential to overturn every theory I've formed thus far. It has no place in my current reconstruction of the crime. Have you attempted to trace the bonds mentioned here? The official investigation is ongoing, but I fear a complete list of South American bonds can only be obtained from South America itself. Tracing them could take weeks." Holmes was examining the notebook's cover with his magnifying glass. "There is no doubt that these areas are discolored. You're quite right, sir. They're bloodstains. I told you." I picked the notebook up from the floor. Was the blood on top of the notebook or beneath it? Along the spine, near the cover. Then that proves the notebook fell to the floor after the murder. I agree entirely, Mr. Holmes. I believe the killer dropped it while fleeing. It was found near the door. And the bonds themselves were not found among the victim's belongings? No, there were no bonds. Any sign of robbery? No, sir. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Curious? Very curious. But there was a knife, was there not? Yes, a knife in its sheath, lying near the victim's feet. Mrs. Carey confirmed that it belonged to her husband. Holmes fell silent for some time, lost in thought. "Very well," he said at last. "I believe I must see the scene of the crime for myself." Stanley Hopkins let out a cry of relief. "Thank you, sir. You've no idea what a burden you're lifting from my shoulders." Holmes raised a finger at him. "A visit a week ago would have been far more productive," he said. "Still, even now it will not be entirely useless. Watson, if you're free, I'd be glad of your company. If you arrange a carriage, Hopkins, we could be on our way to Forest Row within 15 minutes. After disembarking at a small roadside station, we traveled several kilometers through the remnants of ancient woodland. This was once part of the vast forest that had held Saxon invaders at bay for generations. A natural fortress that had shielded Britain for 60 years. Later, the discovery of iron deposits led to widespread deforestation. The trees fell to feed the furnaces. Today, with richer northern mines in operation, all that remained were great pits in the land and scattered groves spared from destruction. Ahead of us, on a green hillside clearing, stood a single-story stone house, reached by a winding road between fields. Between the road and the house was a hut, surrounded on three sides by bushes, its door and windows seeming to stare back at us. This was the scene of a murder. Stanley Hopkins first led us to the house and introduced us to the victim's widow, a frail, gray-haired woman worn down by years of suffering. The terror lurking behind her reddened eyes, the deep lines etched into her gaunt face, spoke volumes of the life she had endured. Her daughter, pale and straight-haired, was also present. There was a disturbing brightness in the girl's eyes, a look that all but proclaimed her satisfaction at her father's death, as though she wished to kiss the hand that had ended him. Peter Carey had cast such terror over his household and life that its shadow lingered even after his death. Walking away from the house, along the sunlit path between fields he had once dominated, brought us an undeniable sense of relief. Black Peter's hut was exceedingly modest. Wooden walls, a roof of wooden shingles, and two windows, one beside the door, the other on the opposite wall. Hopkins took the key from his pocket and bent toward the lock, then suddenly froze. "Someone's been tampering with it," he said. He was right. The wood bore fresh cuts, white beneath the scratch paint. Holmes had moved to examine the window. This was forced as well, but unsuccessfully. Our intruder must be a rather clumsy thief. "This is a very important development," the inspector said. "I swear these marks weren't here yesterday." "Perhaps a curious villager," I suggested. "Highly unlikely," Hopkins replied. "Most villagers wouldn't dare set foot on this land, let alone force the door." "What do you think, Mr. Holmes?" "I think fortune is smiling upon us." "You mean you expect him to return?" "Almost certainly. He came here expecting to find the door open. When he found it locked, he tried to force it with a small knife and failed. What would you expect him to do next? Return the following night with a better tool?" "Precisely. If we fail to catch him, the fault will be ours." "Now then, I'd like to take another look inside the cabin." Though the traces of tragedy had been cleaned away, the furniture remained exactly as it had been on the night of the murder. For 2 hours, Holmes examined every object with meticulous care. His expression suggested no great satisfaction. Only once did he pause. "Did you remove anything from this shelf, Hopkins?" "No, I touched nothing. Something was taken. There's less dust in this corner than elsewhere." "A book or a box laid flat." "Very well. There's nothing more to be done here. Let's take a walk in this fine forest, Watson. We'll spend a few hours among the flowers and birds. Then we'll rejoin you, Hopkins, and see whether we might get a closer look at the gentleman who visited the cabin last night." It was past 11 when we took up our positions. Hopkins favored leaving the door open, but Holmes felt that would arouse suspicion. The lock was simple. Any strong knife would suffice. Holmes also insisted that we hide not inside the hut, but among the bushes behind it. That way, if the intruder lit a lamp, we could observe him and learn the purpose of his secret visit. It was a long, oppressive vigil, yet we felt the hunter's tension, the thrill of lying in wait for prey. What manner of creature would emerge from the darkness? A fierce tiger, to be overcome only in a brutal struggle, or merely a sly jackal, preying on the weak and defenseless? We waited in silence. At first, the distant footsteps of late villagers and faint village sounds eased the strain, but eventually absolute stillness descended. Apart from the church clock marking the hours and the soft rain pattering on the leaves above us, the world was silent. When the clock struck 2:30, deepest darkness before dawn, we were startled by a faint, sharp click from the garden gate. Someone had entered. A long silence followed, and I had begun to think we'd imagined it when I heard cautious footsteps approaching from the far side of the hut. Then came the metallic scrape and click of a tool against the lock. The man was trying again, this time more skillfully. There was a crack, the creak of hinges, a struck match, and soon the steady glow of a candle lit the cabin. We strained to see through the thin curtain. Our visitor was a slight, delicate young man. A black mustache made his pallid face seem even whiter. He could not have been more than 20. I have never seen fear so naked. His teeth chattered, his entire body trembled. He was well dressed, a loose jacket, golf trousers, and a cloth cap. His frightened eyes darted about. He set the candle on the table, stepped out of view, and soon returned with one of the thick logbooks from the shelf. Leaning over the table, he flipped through the pages rapidly. He soon found what he was looking for. Clenching his fist in frustration, he snapped the book shut, returned it, and extinguished the candle. He was about to leave when Hopkins seized him by the collar. The young man let out a bitter groan. When we relit the candle, our captive cowered under the detective's grip, shaking violently, slumping onto the sea chest, and staring at us in helpless terror. "Well, sir," said Stanley Hopkins, "who are you, and what are you doing here?" The young man steadied himself and tried to regain control. "You're detectives, I suppose," he said. "You think I'm involved in Captain Peter Carey's death, but I assure you I'm innocent." "That remains to be seen," Hopkins replied. "First, your name." "John Hopley Nelligan." Holmes and Hopkins exchanged a glance. "What are you doing here?" "May I speak privately?" "Certainly not." "Then why should I tell you anything?" "Because refusing to answer won't help you in court." The young man flinched. "Very well," he said. "I've nothing to fear, but reopening these old records shames me. Have you ever heard of Dawson and Nelligan?" Hopkins clearly had not, but Holmes was instantly attentive. "The West Country bankers?" he asked. "The men who ruined half the families of Cornwall by losing £1,000,000 and then vanished?" "Exactly. Nelligan was my father. At last, we had something tangible." Yet there was still a vast gulf between the vanished bankers and Captain Peter Carey pinned to a wall by his own harpoon. We listened closely as the young man continued. "My father was the central figure in this affair. Dawson had already retired. I was only 10 at the time, but old enough to grasp the horror and disgrace of it all. Everyone claimed my father had stolen the bonds and fled, but that wasn't true. He believed that, given enough time to liquidate them, he could repay every creditor in full. Shortly before a warrant was issued for his arrest, he set sail for Norway in his small yacht. I still remember that final night with my mother. Before leaving, he gave us a list of the bonds he carried, swore he would return with his honor restored, and vowed not to betray the trust placed in him. But we never heard from him again. He vanished forever, yacht and all. My mother and I believed he lay at the bottom of the sea with the bonds, but a loyal family friend, a businessman, later informed us that some of the bonds my father had taken were reappearing on the London market. You can imagine our shock. I traced them for months, through countless difficulties, and at last discovered that the man who had put them back into circulation was the owner of this very cabin, Captain Peter Carey. Naturally, I investigated the man. I discovered that at precisely the time my father was sailing toward Norway, the whaling vessel under Captain Peter Carey's command was returning from the Arctic Ocean. That autumn had been exceptionally stormy. One violent gale after another swept up from the south. My father's yacht could easily have been driven northward and crossed paths with Carey's ship. If that was the case, what became of my father? Whatever the truth, if it could be established how those bonds entered the market through Peter Carey, it would prove that my father had not sold them himself, nor acted out of personal gain when he took them with him. This terrible murder occurred at the very moment I came to Sussex to meet Captain Peter Carey. When I read the investigation report, I learned that his old ship's logbooks were kept in his cabin. I reasoned that if I could discover what happened aboard the Sea Unicorn in August of 1883, I might also uncover my father's fate. I came here last night to reach the logs, but couldn't get inside. Tonight, I succeeded, only to find that the page for that month had been torn out. And then I fell into your hands. Is that all? Hopkins asked. Yes, that's all, he replied, avoiding our eyes. Is there nothing else you wish to tell us? He hesitated. No. You didn't come here before last night? No. Then how do you explain this? Hopkins demanded sharply, holding up the notebook bearing the young man's initials, its cover stained with blood. The evidence was damning. Already shaken, the young man collapsed entirely. He buried his face in his hands and began to tremble violently. Where did you find that? He moaned. I didn't know where it was. I thought I'd lost it at the hotel. That will do, Hopkins said coldly. You can explain the rest in court. You're coming with me to the station now. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm grateful for the trouble you've taken to come all this way, though it appears it wasn't strictly necessary. I believe I could have solved this case without your assistance, but I appreciate it nonetheless. I've reserved 2 rooms for you at the Brambley Hotel. If you like, we can walk back to the village together." The following morning, as we returned to London, Holmes asked, "What do you think of the case? I can see that you're not satisfied." "On the contrary, Watson, I'm perfectly satisfied. What displeases me is Stanley Hopkins's method. I must say, he disappointed me. I expected better. One must always consider alternative explanations and approach a case from multiple angles. That is the first rule of investigation. Then what is the alternative? The investigation I am pursuing. It may lead nowhere, but once I've begun, I must see it through." A large pile of letters awaited Holmes at Baker Street. He opened one and smiled to himself with quiet satisfaction. "Excellent, Watson. Our alternative has progressed. Do you have a telegraph form? Write 2 messages for me. The first, Summer, Shipping Agency, Ratcliffe Highway. Send 3 men here tomorrow morning at 10. Basil. That's my name in that quarter. And the second, Inspector Stanley Hopkins, 46 Lord Street, Brixton. Breakfast tomorrow at 9:30. Important. Telegraph if unable to attend. Sherlock Holmes. This wretched case has occupied my thoughts for 10 days. Watson. Tomorrow, I'm confident we shall close the book on it permanently." The next morning, Inspector Stanley Hopkins arrived precisely on time. We sat down together to the generous breakfast Mrs. Hudson had prepared. The detective was in excellent spirits, pleased with what he believed to be a successful resolution. "Are you quite certain you've solved the case correctly?" Holmes asked. "I can't imagine a more complete solution. There are still some matters that trouble me." "You surprise me, Mr. Holmes. The case is closed. What more could there be? Can you truly say that your explanation accounts for everything?" "Absolutely. We've established that young Nelligan arrived at the Brambley Hotel on the very day of the murder, claiming to be there for golf. His room was on the ground floor, allowing him to come and go freely. That night he went to Woodman's Lee, entered Peter Carey's cabin, and after an argument killed him with a harpoon. Panicked, he fled, dropping his notebook as he ran. You may have noticed that some bond names in the book were marked, while most were not. He had traced the marked ones through the London Stock Exchange. The rest were presumably still in Carey's possession. By his own admission, Nelligan was pursuing those bonds to repay his father's creditors. After fleeing, he lacked the courage to return at once, but eventually he had no choice. He needed the information. Isn't it all perfectly clear? Holmes smiled and shook his head. There's a small problem, Hopkins. Your theory violates the laws of nature. Have you ever tried to drive a harpoon into a human body? No, that's unfortunate. You must learn to attend to such details. Ask my friend Watson. He'll tell you I spent an entire morning practicing with a harpoon. It's no simple task. It requires strength and trained muscles. Yet the harpoon that killed Peter Carey struck with such force that it passed through his body and embedded itself in the wooden wall behind him. Can you seriously believe that frail young man could deliver such a blow? Was the man calmly drinking watered-down rum with Black Peter in the dead of night that same youth we caught? Was the silhouette seen on the curtain 2 nights earlier him? No. Hopkins, no. There is another man we must pursue, a strong man. As Holmes spoke, the inspector's face darkened. His hopes crumbled, yet he was not ready to surrender without a fight. You can't deny that Nelligan was there that night, Mr. Holmes. The notebook proves it. Dismiss it if you like. I have evidence strong enough to convince a jury. I've caught the culprit. But where is this powerful man you speak of? I believe he's on the stairs at this very moment, Holmes said calmly. Watson, you may want to keep your revolver handy. He rose, placed a slip of paper on the side table, and said, Yes, we're ready. Muffled voices came from outside. Mrs. Hudson soon entered. announcing that 3 men were asking for Captain Basil. "Send them in one at a time," Holmes said. The first man was small and round-faced, with rosy cheeks and fluffy white sideburns. Holmes took a letter from his pocket. "Your name?" "James Lancaster." "I'm afraid the position has been filled, Lancaster. Here, take this half-sovereign for your trouble. Wait in the next room." The second man was tall and thin, with sparse hair and pale cheeks. His name was Hugh Patents. He too was dismissed, given half a sovereign, and told to wait. The third applicant was striking. His wild, tangled hair and beard framed a face like a bulldog's. Beneath thick, overhanging brows, a pair of black eyes burned fiercely. He stood like a sailor, holding his folded cap in his hand. "Your name?" Holmes asked. "Patrick Cairns." "You're a harpooner?" "Yes, sir. 26 voyage." "From Dundee, I presume?" "Yes, sir." "Willing to serve aboard an expedition ship?" "Yes, sir." "Your wage?" £8 a month." "Can you start immediately?" "As soon as I gather my things." "Your papers, do you have them?" "Yes, sir." He produced a bundle of grimy documents. Holmes glanced through them briefly, then returned them to the man. "You are exactly the man I've been looking for," said Holmes. "Once you sign the agreement on that side table, the position is yours." The sailor crossed the room with heavy steps and picked up the pen. "Here?" he asked, leaning over the table. At that instant, Holmes lunged forward, looping his arms around the man's neck. "Just like this," he said. There was a sharp metallic click, followed by a roar like that of a maddened bull. In the next moment, Holmes and the sailor were rolling on the floor. The man possessed such brute strength that, had it not been for the handcuffs Holmes snapped on in the blink of an eye, he might well have crushed my friend outright in single combat. Fortunately, Hopkins and I rushed to Holmes's aid. When I pressed the cold muzzle of my revolver against the man's temple, he understood that resistance was futile. By the time we bound his legs with cord, we were all breathing heavily from the struggle. "My apologies, Hopkins," said Sherlock Holmes. "Your eggs have gone cold. Still, I trust that knowing you have truly solved the case will make breakfast just as enjoyable." Stanley Hopkins was speechless with astonishment. At last he managed, "I don't know what to say, Mr. Holmes." His face was crimson. "It seems I made a fool of myself from the very beginning. I now see more clearly than ever that I must never forget I am the student, and you the master. Even now, though I see what you have done, I cannot grasp how you did it, nor what it all truly means." "Never mind," Holmes said with a smile. "We learn through experience. Today's lesson is simple. Never ignore alternatives. You became so fixated on young Nelligan that you never once considered Patrick Cairns, the true killer of Peter Carey." The sailor broke in with a hoarse voice. "Listen to me, sir," he said. "I don't object to being tied up like this, but mind your words. You call me Peter Carey's murderer. I may have killed him, but I am no murderer. Those are not the same thing. You may not believe me. You may think I'm lying." "Not at all," Holmes replied. "We'd like to hear what you have to say." "Very well. I swear before God that every word I speak is true. I knew Black Peter well. When he reached for his knife, I killed him with the harpoon because I knew that if I didn't, he would kill me. That is how he died. Call me a murderer if you wish, but I'd rather face the gallows than die with Peter Carey's blade in my heart." "What were you doing in the cabin?" Holmes asked. "I'll tell you everything from the beginning. Help me sit up. I'll speak more easily." It was August of 1883. We were aboard the Sea Unicorn. Peter Carey was captain, and I was the spare harpooner. We were heading home through the ice fields, fighting headwinds and southern storms, when we encountered a small boat drifting north. There was only one man aboard, a landsman, no sailor at all. The rest of his crew had abandoned ship for the Norwegian coast. believing the vessel doomed. They likely all drowned. We took the man aboard. He spoke privately with the captain at length. The only thing he brought with him was a metal box. I don't believe we ever even learned his name. On the second night after he came aboard, he vanished, as though he'd never existed. It was said he'd thrown himself overboard or fallen during the storm. But only one man knew the truth, and that man was me. During my night watch, I saw the captain creep up behind him and throw him over the rail into the sea. 2 days later, we reached the Shetlands. I kept my silence and waited to see what would happen. By the time we returned to Scotland, the man was forgotten. No one asked questions. A foreigner had died at sea. It mattered to no one. Not long afterward, Peter Carey quit the sea, and it took me years to find him again. I suspected he'd killed the man for what was inside that metal box, and I believed he'd pay handsomely to keep my mouth shut. When I finally learned where he was, through another sailor in London, I went to see him, intending to squeeze some money out of him. The first night we met, he was sober enough and ready to pay me enough to retire on. We agreed to settle the details 2 nights later. When I returned, he'd already had 3 drinks and was in a foul mood. We sat drinking and talking of old times, but the more he drank, the uglier he became. At one point, my eyes fell on the harpoon hanging on the wall. I thought I might need it before I left. In the end, Black Peter exploded, spitting curses, murder in his eyes. He had that great knife in his hand. Before he could draw it, I drove the harpoon into his chest. God, what a scream. That face still haunts my dreams. I stood there for a moment as the blood sprayed everywhere. When nothing happened, I found my courage. I saw the metal box on the shelf. I had as much right to it as Peter Carey. I grabbed it and fled, but like a fool, I left my tobacco pouch on the table. Now comes the strangest part. Just as I stepped outside, I heard someone approaching and hid among the bushes. A man slipped quietly into the cabin. Moments later, he burst out screaming as if he'd seen a ghost, and ran until he vanished from sight. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I walked 16 kilometers, boarded a train at Tunbridge Wells without being seen, and came straight to London. When I opened the box, I found no money, only documents. I dared not cash them in. With Peter Carey dead, my leverage was gone, and I was alone and penniless in London. All I had left was my trade. I saw an advertisement for a harpooner at good wages, applied through a shipping agency, and they sent me here. That's everything I know. The court ought to thank me for killing Black Peter. I've saved them the cost of a rope. Holmes rose and lit his pipe. A remarkably clear statement, he said. I think you'd better remove the prisoner to a secure location at once, Hopkins. This room isn't well suited to holding cells, and Mr. Patrick Cairns takes up far too much space on the carpet. I don't know how to express my gratitude, Mr. Holmes, Hopkins said. Even now, I still can't fully understand how you arrived at this conclusion. From the very beginning, luck favored me. I followed the right clue. Had I known about that notebook, I might have gone astray just as you did. But everything I did have pointed in a single direction. Tremendous strength, mastery of the harpoon, rum diluted with water, a sealskin pouch filled with coarse tobacco. All of it spoke of a whaler. I consider the initials PC on the pouch a coincidence. It couldn't have belonged to Peter Carey. He rarely smoked, and there was no pipe in the cabin. Do you recall my asking whether there was whiskey or brandy present? You said there was. How many landsmen would choose rum when better spirits were at hand? That's why I was certain we were looking for a sailor. But how did you find him? My dear fellow, after that, the work was simple. If the killer was a sailor, he must have served with Carey aboard the Sea Unicorn, for Carey had sailed on no other ship. For 3 days, I telegraphed Dundee, until I obtained the crew list from 1883. When I found the name Patrick Cairns among the harpooners, the matter was nearly settled. I reasoned he'd be in London and eager to leave the country. So I spent several days in the East End, posing as Captain Basil, offering generous terms to harpooners for a North Sea expedition. The result is before you. "Splendid," cried Hopkins. "Splendid. You must see to young Nelligan's immediate release," Holmes said, "and you owe him an apology. Give him the box as well, though nothing can now be done about the bonds Peter Carey sold. Ah, the carriage has arrived. You may take him away, Hopkins. If you need me in court, Watson and I will be somewhere in Norway. I'll send the details later."